Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Made You Book. My name's Gretchen, and in the spirit of Valentine's Day, I thought it would be a fun idea to talk to you about some of my favorite books that revolve around romance. Now, these are not necessarily classified as romance books. Some of them could be, but I more wanted to focus on the stories that are involved in the books. So talking about those great literary couples and those great epic love stories that I have fallen in love with and hold very near and dear to my heart. So let's go ahead and get into the books. So when it comes to romance, I am an absolute sucker for soulmates. And there is not a better book that I can think of than my actual favorite book of all time, which is Persuasion by Jane Austen. Now, I know that it's kind of cliche to have a Jane Austen on a list of my favorite romantic books, but I cannot help myself when it comes to this book. As mentioned, this is my favorite book of all time. I have reread this book so many times, and as far as I'm concerned, there is no better love story than that of Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth. So for those of you that don't know, Persuasion follows Anne Elliot, and in her younger days, her and Bennet Wentworth had a very strong emotional love affair in their youth. Then her family convinced Anne that he was not good enough for her, and they persuaded her to end things. And although she felt she loved him, she followed the advice of her family. And then years later, he comes back into her life, and he comes back as a well-decorated captain in the Navy, and all of a sudden, she has these feelings that are rekindled, and everything else kind of moves forward from that point. And I absolutely love this. There is nothing that I think is more romantic than this book, and there are actually some of the most beautiful, quotable confessions of love in this book. And I think that for any fans of Jane Austen that haven't read Persuasion, give this one a go. Or for those of you that have read Jane Austen and didn't really get along with maybe Pride and Prejudice or some of her other ones, this is the best. I promise you that if you at all appreciate a good soulmate, give this one a chance. All right, so we really can't talk about love and the way that it can be complicated without talking about books that center around epic love affairs. And for my money, the best one out there is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Now, I know I've talked about this book multiple times on my channel so far, but once again, I talk about it for a reason. It's an excellent book, and it not only focuses on the love affair between a married woman, Anna Karenina, and Count Vronsky, but there are also other beautiful love stories in here as well between Kitty and Lennon, and also it talks a lot about a mother's love for her child as well. So there's a lot of love in this book. Although it is tragic at times, I definitely think that this, when I think of epic love stories, this is definitely one that comes to mind almost immediately. I also want to take a couple moments to talk about books that focus on first love. And there are two specific books that always come to mind when I think of a portrayal, a beautiful portrayal of first love. And the first one is Call Me By Your Name by Andre Aciman. And I absolutely love this book. This is one of the most beautifully written books that I have ever read, and the story is absolutely compelling, and although there are definitely problematic parts of this book, it will gut punch you in the end, and I absolutely adored it. This book follows our main character Elio, and I believe he is 16 or 17 years old, and his family lives in this cliffside mansion in the Italian Riviera, and they host a guest one summer named Oliver, and he is American, and he is very quickly the object of Elio's affection, and there's an attraction between the two of them, and they obviously have feelings for each other, and there is just this great love that blossoms between the two of them. I think that it is handled beautifully. The writing is raw, and at times it almost makes you feel a little uncomfortable because of how intimate the book can be, but it is a beautiful story, and if you read the book and you enjoy it, I highly recommend watching the movie with Armie Hammer and Timothée Chalamet as Elio. It absolutely destroyed me. I was bawling my eyes out, and not only was I bawling my eyes out during the movie, it continued for a good half hour after the movie had ended, because it was such a powerful performance, and it is such a beautiful story, and I absolutely loved it. And this is truly, I think, one of the greatest love stories of all time. Another book that I always think of when it comes to stories about first love is a book that I read myself when I think I was 13 or 14, and I revisit it as an adult periodically, but every time I read it, I just have such strong feelings of nostalgia for it. Even though I learn something new from it every time I read it, it always takes me back to being that teenage girl and getting those feelings of what it was like for me at the time when I had my very first crush. The book is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, and this book follows our main character. Her name is Cassandra, and she is super smart. She is precocious, and she lives with a large family, and they are very eccentric, and they actually live in this dilapidated old castle. They don't have a whole lot of money. The castle is falling apart all around them, but they make do with what they have. And one day, the heir of the castle, after I believe his uncle dies, shows up to the castle, and they end up there's two of them, and one of them ends up kind of sweeping Cassandra off of her feet. She is absolutely smitten with this man, and we just kind of live inside the head of this teenage girl as she is exploring what it's like for her first crush, and it's an absolute gem of a book. I highly recommend this if you haven't read it, and also if you do get through the book and you enjoy it, like Call Me By Your Name, there is an excellent movie adaptation that is really good, and I absolutely loved that as well. The next book that I want to talk about falls into the category of love that was lost, or the one that got away. And the best book that I can think of that encapsulates this is The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali. This book takes place in the 1950s in Tehran, and it follows our main character, Roya, who is a teenager that loves all things books and poetry, and she takes comfort in spending time at her local stationery shop that's run by Mr. Fakhri. And Mr. Fakhri sees the way that she responds to one of the customers named Bauman, and Mr. Fauchery, does everything he can to try to get that budding romance going, and they end up getting together, Roya and Bauman, and fast forward, they end up getting to the point where they are going to get married, and on the eve of their marriage, Roya convinces Bauman that they should meet in the town square, and during that supposed meeting, Roya is there, but Bauman never shows up because in the midst of her waiting, violence erupts and there's absolute chaos, and there is a coup d'etat at the time that basically changes the landscape of their country. So Roya, after that, looks and looks and looks for him and never finds him, and after a fruitless search, she eventually decides to give up, and the book then follows her life into adulthood, where she escapes Tehran and she travels to the States, and she ends up becoming an academic, and she gets married to another man, and we learn more about her life as an adult. And although she has moved on, she has still always harbored feelings for Bauman and wonders why he didn't show, why he left her, why he didn't look for her. She assumes the worst, and it is just an absolutely beautiful story, and I don't want to give any more of that away, but this is another one that is absolutely going to tug at your heartstrings. It was beautifully written, and I think that anybody that is a sucker for those kind of lost love or the one that got away type of romances, you are absolutely going to love this book. All right, so moving on to our next love topic, I'm going to recommend a book that includes forbidden romance. So that's always a subject that intrigues me, kind of like that Romeo and Juliet on the opposite side of the tracks kind of romance. And the best book that I can think of to capture that is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. So this book I read last year. It was longlist, or no, I think it was actually shortlisted for the Women's Prize, and it follows our main character, Kushla. She is a Catholic woman that is living in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. She is a Catholic school teacher, and she is also helping out at her brother's pub. One day she meets one of the customers. His name is Michael. He is older, he is married, and he's also Protestant. And obviously those two, Catholics and Protestants, don't mix during the Troubles, and they somehow end up coming together and having this passionate love affair. Now, there's a lot more going on in this novel than just a love story, but I absolutely adored this book. This was so good, and I know I've talked about this book before, but it really does capture that tense, suspenseful, taboo type of romance that so many people do really like to read about. I love Louise Kennedy's writing. I definitely think that this is worth a read. So one of the great things I love about love stories is they don't always have to be romantic in nature. You could have platonic love, you could have love for your pets, you could have love for your family. So the next couple books that I'm going to talk about will fit those bills. So first of all, let's talk about the love that we have for our four-legged friend. There is a book that is called Lily and the Octopus by Stephen Rowley, and it is one of the best books that I have ever read about an owner and a pet relationship. It follows our main character, Ted, and he has a dachshund that is aging, and her name is Lily. And as Lily gets older, her health starts to decline, and he obviously is having a hard time dealing with that, as we all do when our pets get to that age or they're not doing so well. And I think that Stephen Rowley did such a beautiful job of not only depicting that relationship between Ted and his dog Lily, but also the way that we grieve when it comes time for our pets to pass away, that anticipatory grief we have, and also how fierce love can be between a human and an animal. And it's so hard to let go of the family that our pets are to us. And yeah, I think that I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. It's a beautiful story, and I think that everybody that is an animal lover can get something from this book. I also know that for any of you that have lost a pet, it might be a little triggering to read, and I completely understand that, but you might also find solace in it as well. Another book that had me in my feels the whole time is Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. And this follows the story of Michelle. It's a memoir, and it tells of how she grieved the loss of her mother. And it is such a wonderful story. So for those of you that don't know, Hmart is a popular Korean grocery store, and every time since her mother has passed, Michelle goes to Hmart, she finds herself kind of conjuring up all of those memories of her mother, because her mother was such a guiding light for her in her life, and she very much associates her mother with food, and being in that grocery store really kind of takes her down memory lane. And it's such a poignant and very relatable story. It doesn't necessarily have to be a grocery store, but there are so many times when, you know, we as people that have lost loved ones are triggered by certain things going on in our lives, and we associate certain things with certain people that we've loved and lost. And I think that this was a great memoir, and I think she just did a really good job of getting her feelings out there without it being really flowery or over the top. I think that it was raw and it was honest, and I really enjoyed it. And I think that, once again, obviously, if you are dealing with grief or if you have recently lost someone, you could find it triggering, but you could also, you know, find comfort and solace in it and find ways to cope with that grief to help you move forward. So although this is not your traditional love story, it does highlight that love that a mother and daughter do share with each other, and I think that it was a great depiction of what familial love can be for someone. And the other book that kind of fits into the non-traditional love stories is Just Kids by Patti Smith. Now, this is another memoir, and this follows Patti as she is in her very youthful adult days. She is out on her own and she's trying to find herself, and she meets the enigmatic Robert Mapplethorpe, and she quickly bonds with him. And at first it is friendship. It then very quickly turns to a love affair, and then as that love affair continues, she realizes that Robert is actually gay, and although their romantic love is over, their friendship continues, and they had such a special bond, such a special relationship. And it's basically Patti telling that story, but also, for those of you that are not aware, Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a very famous photographer, he ended up dying of AIDS, and it's her story also about how she dealt with that and how she processed it, and just the love that they had for each other up until the very end. And it is a tearjerker. It is beautifully written, and once again, it being a memoir makes it all the more just impactful, because these were real people having real experiences and having real emotions, and I absolutely loved it. It was actually really surprising for me. Now, you know, Patti Smith being a musician, I knew that the writing would be beautiful as a lyricist, but wow, she absolutely nailed this memoir, and I was in tears, and it totally pierced my heart, and I absolutely loved it. So if there's a hole in your life and you're looking for a good book about the power of friendship and the love that friends can have for each other, this is a great book. But also keep in mind, it can be very triggering because it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's so beautiful, and I highly recommend it. Now, another type of love that I want to focus on, and I have two books to talk about, is unrequited love. Like, how tragic is it that a person can be so totally in love with someone and those feelings not be returned? It's so sad, but it happens so often. And there are two specific books that I think really do a great job of capturing those feelings. One is an old classic and one is a modern classic. And we'll go with the old classic first, and that is actually Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This to me has an iconic unrequited love story as part of it. I don't think that there are many people that don't know the plot of Great Expectations, but basically this follows our main character Pip. He is an orphan, and the basic kind of unrequited love story follows Pip with a girl called Estella Havisham, and she is the granddaughter of the eccentric Mrs. Havisham, who was jilted at the altar on her wedding day, and she is this crazy old bat of a woman that never really fully recovered from that jilting at the altar, and ever since then she has lived every day in her wedding dress, and the wedding feast that was laid out remains in her house, in her mansion. So yeah, it's very eccentric, it's very unique, and I absolutely love the character of Mrs. Havisham, but her jilting led her to be very suspicious of men and to be very untrusting, and she passes those cruel feelings toward men onto her granddaughter Estella, and Pip, who is infatuated with her, becomes the victim of unrequited love. And I think that obviously there's a lot more going on to the story than just that element, but this is kind of one of the very first books that I read that I can think of that has that unrequited love story as part of it. So, and it's a classic. I mean, who doesn't love a classic? The next book that kind of depicts my definition of unrequited love well is a more modern classic, and that is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And this book follows our main character, David, and he meets Giovanni in this bar, and from there he becomes completely enamored and obsessed with him, and they start this intense love affair. However, David doesn't really want to cope or admit the feelings that he has for Giovanni, so he pretends that it never happened, and all of the while David is denying this, we have Giovanni whose life is crumbling all around him. And the book comes to a head with a very tragic incident, and it is just super powerful, super intense. This is not going to be your touchy-feely, happy ending type romance, but the affair is intense, it's passionate, and I think that it does have a lot to offer the reader when it comes to that unrequited love trope. And yeah, I mean, also, if you've never read anything by James Baldwin, I think this is a really good entry. It's a very short book, but it is so powerful, and James Baldwin was an absolute master. I really don't think he gets enough credit for everything he has provided us with his literature, and yeah, I recommend you giving this a chance if you don't mind a messy, not so happy ending type of book. All right, so this one is kind of a little out there, but stick with me. So when it comes to love, like I said before, there are so many different types of love. It just doesn't have to be romantic. And when you stop to think about or ask yourself the question, what is love? There can be so many different opinions on that. So if you are an academic, or if you're looking for a book that tackles more of the philosophical side of love, then I suggest that you read The Symposium by Plato. Now, this book is not going to actually give you a love story of such, but what it does is it takes a kind of humorous look from a group of Athenian intellectuals that get together after a night of heavy drinking, and they start to debate with each other what love is, and each of the men gives their own interpretation of what they believe love truly is and why it exists, and it talks about gender roles and, you know, human instinct and all of those things. It has kind of like dissertations from Plato. It also has a section where there's a debate between all of the other guys and Socrates, and it was actually, although it is very academic in a sense, and I mean it is philosophy, it was actually, for me, I found it to be very entertaining, and it was interesting to see how many different angles you can look at love from. And I know this isn't going to be for everybody, and you're not going to get, like I said, a true love story out of it, but it is just a fun, because we are talking about love, is a fun little book to read if you're looking for a more academic or kind of sterile depiction of what love is. All right, so the next kind of love trope that I want to talk about is enemies to lovers, and you cannot get more enemies to lovers than the OG enemies to lovers book, Pride and Prejudice. And I don't know where my copy is. It is shameful. I have like 5 different copies of this book and I cannot find a single one of them. But I digress. So I know I already had a Jane Austen on my list earlier with Persuasion, but I would be remiss to not include Pride and Prejudice as part of this list when we're talking about love. This truly was the first book that I know of that really depicted that enemies to lovers with the tension and the hate and just the passion that they had in disliking each other to end up being madly in love with each other toward the end. And I absolutely love this book. Now, I know that we talked about Anne and Captain Wentworth, but the dynamic between Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy is completely different. They get off on the wrong foot. He says something stupid that's offensive to her. He finds her and her family very grating and beneath him, and she finds him arrogant and proud, and ultimately they misread each other, of course, and then when we get toward the end, all of the true feelings and the true characters of each of them is highlighted for each of them, and then they learn that they don't actually hate each other, that it is love. And I am sorry if I spoiled that for anybody. I don't think that there's a single person out there that shouldn't know the plot of Pride and Prejudice by now, but once again, this is another great book to read and then watch the movie. I think it was the 2005, I think is when it was made, but the version with Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen, I absolutely love that movie. That is one of my comfort movies. If there's ever a day when I'm having just no luck and the world is looking bleak, that book always puts me back into a better mood, and it's beautiful. And I think that if you haven't ever read Pride and Prejudice, give it a chance. I know it's not going to be for everyone. Classic literature can be a little too much for people to get through sometimes because the language is a little flowery and it is Old English, so you do have to think, but if you can get past that, it is an absolute great story. And if you don't want to read the book, just watch the movie. I promise it's a good one. Next, I want to talk about the dark side of love and give you a book recommendation if you are not feeling Valentine's Day at all and you are just anti-love and you are just feeling very toxic toward Valentine's Day in general. You might want to pick up Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, I will be the first to admit that I am not a fan of this book. As a matter of fact, I would even say that I hate this book, but I am going to try to reread it this year. The first time I read it, it was several years ago, and I didn't really appreciate it. I didn't find it to be anything spectacular, and my biggest takeaway from it was, if this is supposed to be one of the greatest romances of all time, it is completely toxic. The relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff is toxic. It is the definition of toxic and codependent, and I just didn't care for that. There were parts of it that I did enjoy, and I will say that the drama between Catherine and Heathcliff was what initially got me invested in the story, but about halfway through, the book changes and it goes down a different path, and we're no longer really talking about the relationship of Catherine and Heathcliff. We're talking about the relationships of their children, and It's a weird dynamic. Heathcliff, he's no Darcy, let's put it that way. He is a horrible person. He treats her terribly. They're both just very, to me, unlikable characters, and I was never able to get on board cheering for them. But there are so many people out there that love and adore this book, and like I said, I'm gonna give it another chance this year. I don't want to completely write it off, but yeah, this would be kind of my anti-Valentine's Day read if I were going to choose one. All right, so one of the other things, I know we talked a little bit about soulmates at the beginning with Anne and Captain Wentworth in Persuasion, but there's another book that fits the bill for that as well, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now, I know that this is a beloved book out there, and most people that are probably interested in reading or on BookTube have probably read this book. However, this book is so romantic and it's so beautiful, and the love story between Achilles and Patroclus will absolutely destroy you. Their commitment to each other was just beautifully depicted in here, and the last 15 pages of this book had me sobbing. Like, I had to take a break going through these last few pages, and very rarely do books do that to me. I'm a crier, and I typically will cry at movies when I can see things unfolding in front of me, but this book had my heart in a vice, and it squeezed every last tear out of me. If you can get through this book without feeling some type of emotional flutter in your heart, I would get to a doctor soon, because you might be close to death. And yeah, I think this is beautiful. I think it definitely deserves all of the hype that it gets. And I think that it's also a beautiful depiction of a gay romance. And I think that anybody who believes in love could take something away from this book. And the last book that I will talk about today falls into the it's complicated category, and that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Now, I absolutely adore this book. I know that Sally Rooney can be a somewhat polarizing author for a lot of people, but I loved this book with all my heart. This book had me in such a tizzy at the end. It stuck with me. It sticks with me to this day. This is another depiction of a toxic relationship between two people. Our main characters, we have Connell and we have Marianne. The big difference for this is we get insight as to why these characters are the way they are. We understand more about why they treat each other the way they do. And I think that what Sally Rooney is just a master at is writing not books that everybody wants to believe happens in a real relationship, but talks about how complicated they really are, and us being humans and having complex feelings and complex responses to people loving us, and us being human and just not completely getting it all of the time. We're human. We're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna make choices that even we don't understand, and I think that she did that so well, and my heart broke for each of these characters in a completely different way, but I didn't find them unlikable. I didn't find them grating like I did with Heathcliff and Catherine. I feel like they brought a lot of their own drama on themselves, in that book. But here we get more, like I said, insight of everything else that's going on in Connell and Mary Ann's life, so we can better understand why they're doing the things they do, the motivation that they have for maybe not treating each other very fairly. And at the end of the day, I almost think that Mary Ann and Connell could be considered soulmates, and not in the romantic sense, but sometimes there are just people in your life that you connect with, and you may not like that you connect with them. It might not be a romantic connection. It could be a strong platonic connection. It could be, and it's complicated, connection, but it doesn't change the fact that you are bonding or bonded. This book goes through everything. It goes through all of the beauty, and it goes through all of the ugliness of what it's like to be in a relationship with somebody. It talks about the happiness. It talks about the joy that is sparked between two people that are in love with each other. It also talks about the brutal parts of a relationship, the jealousy, the fighting, the arguments, the tension, the underlying struggles that you have internally that are a problem within each of the relationships. And it just does such a great job of hashing all of that out. And I think that obviously if you're not a fan of Sally Rooney because you've read other books of hers, you are not likely to get on with this one. But I absolutely loved this, and I am still to this day fighting for Mary Ann and Connell. I know I will probably die on that mountain. This book also is brilliant in the sense that the characters know. They're very aware of how toxic their relationship is. They try to stay away from each other. They try, but they can't. And that just goes to show how we can be imprinted on people. We have people come into our lives for reasons, and we are, whether it's, I mean, is it chemical? Is it spiritual? Who knows? But I think we've all been there where we have had very strong feelings for someone that we know is not good for us. And I think that it's just a very real book. And I love the fact that Sally Rooney isn't afraid to write a novel about real dialogue and real relationships, and not sugarcoat it, and not have all of these happy endings that are neatly tied up with a ribbon and everybody gets exactly what they want and no one is sad, and that's just not reality. And Sally Rooney is a master at, whether we like it or not, showing us what real life can dish out. So love this one. And that's it. Those are all of the books that I recommend to read either on Valentine's Day or leading up to Valentine's Day. I'm curious to know, what are some of your favorite love stories? Are there any on my list that you've read that you agree with, or maybe you don't agree with some of the books that I have on my list? I would love to hear about them. I do hope that if you are one that enjoys Valentine's Day, that you have a lovely one. And until we read again, bye!